Yeah, a quick note before we begin. Today's story touches on explosives. It touches on the early American munitions industry. I'm not an expert in weapons. This is a story about people who fled political violence, building an empire on the Brandywine River with controlled explosions. A story about empire as organization. It's complicated, to put it gently. I wanted to open with a note on that. It's summer of 1818, and along the Brandywine River, the ground has shuddered. The stone walls have ruptured, and there's a plume of smoke that lifts above the trees. An explosion occurred. Not a scandal, not something that's going to make national headlines, not even unusual. Mills will be rebuilt. Production will come back. The river's going to keep flowing. What's happened, though, is another explosion, one of many, rolling through a valley just north of Wilmington, Delaware. If you want to understand the history of the DuPont company, you don't want to start with innovation. You don't want to start with science, not even gunpowder. Start with Delaware. Delaware is the first state to ratify the Constitution in 1787. Delaware is small. It's commercially oriented. It specializes in saying yes quietly rather than no loudly. Delaware is a place where land is more important than rhetoric, where the ownership is more important than the visibility of what is owned. The state's primary civic talent has appeared to be getting out of the way without disappearing. Sometimes getting out of the way while oddly staying in the center. Some kinds of power need to have space, and some kinds of danger need to have discretion. What are they doing that's making it blow up? Now, we need to leave Delaware for a moment and we take a trip back to the 1790s. Everything that once seemed to be permanent is suddenly shaken and appears can be rerouted. Titles, institutions, and the legitimacy of certain types of knowledge become questionable. The French Revolution doesn't merely overthrow monarchy, although they certainly do that in a dramatic fashion. They also dismantle the infrastructure that allowed France in the 1700s to believe that their expertise would protect them. Antoine Lavoisier, the architect of modern chemistry, the person who systematized measurement itself, would be arrested and executed. The Republic no longer had a need for scientists, apparently. This is what the judge reportedly said, in French though, which I'm not going to try to translate. The message became unmistakable. Science wasn't failing. Politics began to redefine what it meant to be scientific. And so among those paying attention is a young chemist who lived there, Irénée DuPont, was not self-taught, not even marginal. He was trained directly by Lavoisier, and his father is a political economist, also a reformer, and a person who would advise government. The family doesn't lose power in the revolution. They lose that sense of certainty and stability. That seems to collapse. People begin to get nervous when they're used to that stability. The question became, where can we go where expertise could operate without being potentially interpreted as treason? I say that too casually because this is an uncertain time, the time where a number of revolutions are taking place, the American Revolution. In 1799, the DuPont family leaves France. They don't leave without any plan or structure. They first arrive in Newport, Rhode Island, which was a common landing for French immigrants. They were carrying letters, reputation, intellectual capital. Already knows Thomas Jefferson, not casually. We met one time from across the room, but a fellow Enlightenment thinker with similar interest in political economies, agriculture, and by extension, land. This becomes very important in understanding the history of the DuPont Chemical Company. Jefferson, of course, is obsessed with land, private land, productive land, land as a moral backbone of the Republic, especially in Virginia. This is not the point of this particular episode. Probably won't be the point in a lot in the future either. But my point is that this is not a friendship that's based on sentiment, or it's not based on just shared interest and familiarity through international channels. It's a worldview that's shared and about land that stabilizes power, that disciplines ambition, and that absorbs the risk. Elithaire Irénée DuPont does not immediately build anything when he arrives in Rhode Island. Instead, he decides to traverse, because they are from the elite in France, he decides to traverse New Jersey and Pennsylvania and that mid-Atlantic corridor to inspect what a mill would look like, to study water power, to evaluate the transport routes and observe the competitors that may be present wherever he decides to land. By doing so, he decides not just to land in Delaware, but to land with a boom, because gunpowder is volatile. It is heavy, also political. When he arrives at the Brandywine River, he arrives at a narrow, fast-moving point in northern Delaware that is uneven, where water power is not necessarily considered to be reliable, but because of commercial focused centrality, they allow for production to be segmented. Delaware offers a proximity to Philadelphia, to Washington, D.C., to New York as well, and to the federal government's need for gunpowder at the time. The gunpowder in the United States was garbage. But in 1802, DuPont purchases land along the Brandywine River. In January 1800, the Delaware River is wearing its winter colors. Cold pewter, chopped sheets of ice, they grind softly against one another. A small ship has nosed its way upriver toward Philadelphia, and on board, a few family members whose name will be one day stitched into everything from nylon stockings to nuclear research to the munitions provided during the First World War. Also, kitchen drawers to Superfund sites. That's per part 2 in this morning in 1800. They are refugees. They are cold. They are tired of being at sea, but they are happy to be alive. And Pierre Samuel DuPont de Nemours stands at the rail that's wrapped. He's wrapped in a coat that has already lost that Parisian swagger to the salt of the Atlantic Ocean. Beside him is Eleuthère Irénée, the apprentice of Lavoisier, the future founder of America's most powerful chemical conglomerate, watching the shoreline appearing through a gray fog. What he sees, mostly farms, mostly forests, it's mills, and it's faint outlines of a new nation that is trying to imagine itself into some sense of permanence within a new landscape, new political landscape anyway. The DuPonts didn't come for adventure. They came because France had turned on itself with such ferocity that the moderates, their family was moderates. They were in favor of reform, but they were not revolutionaries. Okay. They barely escaped the revolution's guillotine, though. They were protected by good timing more than political allies, but they did have some political allies as well, certainly. They crossed the ocean toward a different republic that was forming, in theory at least, and promising fewer heads on pikes. For the moment, they're guests, but they're also something else. They're skilled. They have expertise. They are well connected, and they are ambitious. And they carry with them some ideas about industry, about national economies. They see this other nation that is also being newly formed, and they see the opportunity to shape it alongside others. They carry this unmistakable confidence of elites who have survived catastrophe and now see opportunity perhaps everywhere. Gunpowder in 1800, US America, is a patchwork of inconsistency, dangerous in the wrong way, dangerous even use by people who are loading it into munitions. Hunters are complaining about their muskets misfiring. Military officers are worrying privately that, hey, if a war breaks out, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. Practically delivered to Jefferson's doorstep, because I think Jefferson is president by this point, or he's about to be, is a person who has apprenticed in France's most sophisticated powder works. And he has a son who learned from Lavoisier itself. By the following year, by 1801, the DuPonts will take a river voyage south to Delaware along the Brandywine. Not merely a case of better science, but it's an entire philosophy of manufacturing also. It's a philosophy of precision and quality control, which is two things that this show is about. Why this particular episode in history is compelling. I don't usually talk about history on this show, but today we will. From this patchwork in Delaware comes a company that supplies nearly half of the Union's explosives in the Civil War and 40% of the Allies' munitions in World War I. More chemical innovations, morally ambiguous, as we'll see. They disembark as refugees, as visionaries, threaded through secrecy and innovation, and sometimes harm, aspiration, and fallout. What's complicated? Here, at the icy edge of a barely formed nation, is the beginning of a story that will eventually reshape everything from warfare to cookware, from agriculture and land to architecture, from the promises of scientific precision to the crises that explosions leave behind. Undecisions at the Fulcrum. We're talking about DuPont. We're talking about the long shadow of a few empires that were built on the science of dangerous ideas. Okay, let's go to this crucial expansion. I want to ask a question. Why gunpowder? In 1802, gunpowder isn't just a product, it's infrastructure. Volatile, heavy, and political. In the early US, it's everywhere. It clears land for farms, and it fuels the idea of expansion. It becomes controversial. Again, we're just talking about one particular legacy today. I'm not going into the other histories. In doing so, gunpowder arms this upstart nation that does not yet trust its own permanence. Rightly so. Wars have disrupted shipping, embargoes, rewrite supply chains overnight, and neutrality is not an option here. It turns out independence is logistical. Gunpowder is one of the very few materials that the federal government must be able to secure domestically. Private producers begin to step in as stabilizers of state capacity. French powder is famously superior to the British stuff, not because of anything that has to do with France, but it has to do with the methods they're using. The purity of the ingredients, the precision of milling, the control of moisture, and the discipline of the process. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the purity of ingredients has to do with what gunpowder is made of, which I believe is three things. It's potassium nitrate, charcoal, and sulfur. In the 18th century in the US, the potassium nitrate can be contaminated with dirt or salts. Charcoal is different depending on what it came from, how it was burned. Sulfur can be impure or it can be uneven completely. In French state laboratories where DuPont trained, they were obsessive about refining and standardizing these inputs. And they had the backing to do so for a while. When we say like purity of ingredients, what I mean is that the powder behaves the same way every time because the raw materials are controlled, tested, and consistent. What DuPont brings is not just a better science, but it is that. How do we know that? It's something closer to what we would call methodological or research, like reliability, essentially. That capacity for a process to produce the same outcome under the same conditions again and again. It comes in different flavors. Reliability it can be measured statistically. It's a specific numerical data point, or it is a specific outcome. It's a result. The numbers are the outcome of a process that can be calculated to represent the test's level of consistency. There are four types of reliability that can be reported in research. There's internal reliability, which refers to whether the performance for each time that this process or these materials, or if you're taking a test, are the results consistent across different items within a single test? If they are, you can say, all right, well, I need to make sure that they are. You test, retest reliability. I ask, is the result for each time that I create this, each time that I give this survey, is it consistent across 3 administrations of the same survey, of the same test, of the same process to create something, whether it's food or whether it's explosives? If the powder behaves the same way every time because the raw materials are controlled, tested, and consistent, we can say we have reliability. If your saltpeter varies, if the charcoal comes different woods that are burned at different temperatures, then no amount of skill is going to save you. DuPont reduces variance at the input level, though, and that's reliability. It starts before the process even begins. We look at whether we perform the same steps, perform the same way, lead to the same mixing ratios don't change. Milling speeds will not drift. Drying times cannot be improvised. This is where the discipline of process begins to do its work. We need to ask if they make high stakes decisions, sell their product, utilize it for the state or private companies using these chemicals. Is the DuPont company or is another company confident that their outcomes can be produced over and over again following the same method? Reliability matters because it's expected scientific products need to be consistent internally and externally. Internally, we're measuring the same construct or we're following the same steps and we're seeing similar results each time we do this in this way. And externally, whether or not similar results are administered again and again over time across different contexts. These are issues of reliability. When we have the ingredients, we don't just mix them together. They are ground and blended in these large mills, often powered by water wheels. This step is dangerous. If you grind it too coarsely, the powder is going to burn unevenly. If you grind it too finely, the friction and the heat are going to increase, which will risk I think accidental detonation. If you grind it unevenly, the performance is going to vary. Take this knowledge of how research works. You can apply scientific process to understand things that, for me, I'm not an expert in munitions, like I said, but I can take my research background and can apply it to understand this. And that's what I'm trying to explain today. We talk about how precision milling, what does it mean? It means the physical structure of the powder is not improvised. It's mechanical discipline, non-negotiable. The next thing is that we need to control for the moisture. Gunpowder does not like water. It does not like being bone dry. If it has too much moisture, it's not going to ignite properly. If it has too little moisture, it's going to have static electricity and it's going to become very problematic due to friction. Therefore, the location of a river valley with consistent airflow and all together as a discipline of process. We have standardized procedures that train workers following exact steps that document there's no improvisation. Less mysterious to see how the DuPont family took advantage of a moment in which a very young nation needed munitions due to a sense of uncertainty and instability at the moment. And because the process was methodical, because you could see the results through the consistency that it was presented as, it was engineered through controlled materials, precise machines, environmental management, disciplined processes that still resulted in explosions nonetheless. It doesn't mean it's perfect. We can see how DuPont had a real advantage in the US. We can see how they were not necessarily inventors as much as they are system builders and adapters, and this foreshadowed the company's later identity as Quiet Power. Where do we go from here? In order to get a better picture of what the world was like in this period, let's go in our time machine and see if we can go farther back than we have gone before. Just to 1811, though. Let's go to a Wilmington counting house tavern. Above a Wilmington tavern, a hybrid space where merchants and lawyers and politicians share information in Wilmington and eavesdrop on a conversation. We're around the lobby area of this tavern, and around me, I'm looking around and there they are. DuPont himself and a senator, Senator Bayard. Senator Bayard is one of the most influential political figures in the early U.S. during this era, from Delaware, Federalist who believes in compromise, and he is very concerned with national survival, with trade, and with supplies. In 1811, I'm standing here in this tavern. I'm looking over at Senator Bayard and Mr. DuPont, and a conversation I can hear very clearly in this private room in Wilmington during the winter light. There are papers on the table. No speeches, no witnesses here, except for me here, just kind of casually pretending like I'm just looking around. And in this, let's listen to what they say.
He understands the difficulty.
We insist we do not want war while quietly preparing to survive one. That contradiction is becoming expensive.
His supply UV requires powder that discharge the same way twice.
You know the British blockade is tightening. Delaware has no appetite for spectacle, Mr. DuPont.
That is why I am here. I will continue to build something that does not ask for attention.
I see, but it may become indispensable.
Okay. This works because it shows how state dependence forms without a lot of formal policy. DuPont became infrastructure, not contractor, like we would see later with the U.S. Department of Defense. It keeps Delaware's role quiet but central. It avoids that anachronistic nationalism that people can tend to fall into when they overlook the details and the honest reality of what probably actually happened. There's like the mythos in the event, and we can let reliability be the currency of trust here. Before transitioning into the War of 1812 and post-war expansion era, DuPont's emergence is part of the national anxiety over surviving as a nation. By 1811, DuPont is not necessarily the best option of several. It's the only option that satisfies the constraints that are presented in the moment all at once. The United States could not rely on imported gunpowder, especially not from Britain, and not from France either. The British supply was politically impossible and somewhat behind in terms of compared to other European nations. The French supply is unreliable, and the shipping lanes are fragile at the time. That's a very different era. Independence was logistical, like I said, instead of ideological. There were foreign producers, but none could be trusted under the blockade conditions that seemed to be on and off. If we think about the existing American powder as being inconsistent, if we think about gunpowder requiring state-grade processing discipline, tinkering is not the way to go when it comes to gunpowder. A textile mill can produce uneven cloth, but a gunpowder mill produces explosions. DuPont, I don't say that to be dramatic. I'm just saying it to point out the reality of what happened. DuPont brings a trained expertise in chemical discipline and a bureaucratic process understanding of bureaucracies and intolerance for improvisation and documentation after documentation after documentation, which was fashionable at the time and it still is today. This isn't entrepreneurship, in other words. This is a way to transfer their European state system into a privatized American setting where the commercial empires seem to be welcome in states around the mid-Atlantic. No other American producer had produced this type of training lineage. You have talented amateurs, but that doesn't even compare when it comes to what the state needs to fight potential invaders. Okay. Subtly but crucially, though, the state could not run it directly. The early U.S. government does not like centralization. also did not like standing armies, and they did not have very much administrative capacity. They did not have the political legitimacy in Europe to run an explosive manufacturing to get backing for it. The federal government needed powder nonetheless, but they didn't know how to provide it for themselves. DuPont's like, hey, I have the training to do that. In Delaware, they just beat everyone else. Even if another producer had the knowledge, they would still need the land that was configured for segmented risk, the water power, and the proximity to the government buyers. A state a state that is willing to tolerate danger quietly. Delaware offered four things. Let's go through the checklist. Commercial pragmatism, check. Minimal spectacle, check. Legal patience, check. Politically silent, check. Just a wink and a nod of understanding. DuPont, in other words, did not just bring in the right process. They also brought in the right jurisdiction and an understanding of how that worked. The imports unreliable, domestic producers inconsistent, state ownership politically unthinkable. What remains is one choice, a private firm that is run with state-grade discipline and embedded in a jurisdiction that specializes in discretion. DuPont did not win this war, did not become the primary supplier of half of the Union's munitions and 40% of the munitions for the United States, at least in the First World War, through a competitive edge. They did so only by positioning themselves in a system that had no other choice. That seems like inevitability, but it is structural convergence. Important though, we're not saying that no one else could have done this. We're not saying that this was a great genius. The constraints of 1811, alternatives would collapse faster than any of them could scale. That is the more sophisticated and defensible claim, grounded in human experience, in my view. Where we can go next with this, once they become indispensable, the relationship is flipped. The state doesn't feel like they need to evaluate them anymore. They start planning around them. The War of 1812 locks in that dependence on them. This is contingency under constraint. It's important to say this clearly, without drama, but it's important to say it clearly that DuPont, not destiny, not brilliance that's rewarded as brilliance. Also an insecure nation that's suddenly aware of its own fragility. In 1811, the United States is not very confident. It's thinly resourced. It's politically divided. No, that's different. It's strategically exposed, though. That independence sense, right, is on paper. But its supply chains tell a more anxious story because they're very dependent on the munitions of European manufacturers. DuPont then fits, not because they're extraordinary, but because they are available, because they are nearby in the moment that a system has narrowed its tolerances. If the tolerances for the lack of reliability that the gunpowder industry was presenting within the domestic borders. If DuPont had not existed, someone else likely would have emerged, but not necessarily in time, not necessarily with the same reliability, not necessarily with the same place. History is full of moments where things change not because of ideals, certainly not because of a single person, not because of a single group, but because of logistics, or because of weather, or because whether powder arrives when it's needed, or whether it performs as expected, or whether failure is considered to be catastrophic or costly. The War of 1812 could have unfolded differently. If the U.S. had a supply system, they would have prolonged this. They may have reshaped the outcome, may have altered how the United States understands itself today. And had that happened, we may be living with that version of history as the normal version. We would be. The DuPont family, in this episode, I'm talking about path dependence. Once a system solves a vulnerability, even if they do so imperfectly and with imperfection, they build forward from that solution anyway. The alternatives have faded, the dependence has deepened, and what began as a workaround became an infrastructure. That's how a nation or a culture begins to stabilize, or an industry begins to stabilize. By making a commitment to one early, and by doing it often, reliably, to the first future that seems to work to meet all of those to check all those boxes. We can think of some parallels to compare with. I don't want to just focus on the 1800s. Let's come back to the present day, and let's think about when states have faced vulnerabilities that they cannot manage openly, whether it's information or logistics or even military. They often outsource reliability to the private actors who do not look, I'm putting quotes here if you see me, but this isn't a video podcast yet, but they don't look like heroes. They're pretty quiet, they're unassuming, and they become indispensable because of that. That's the pattern. When we think about this, let's compare a structural parallel. The US government faced a similar problem in the early 2000s. They had a vulnerability and they had a fragmented information flow. They had pressure to act fast and limited internal capacity to build new systems. They needed data integration. They needed reliability under uncertainty. They turned to private contractors because they were available, disciplined, and positioned inside the existing networks already. Much like the gunpowder in 1802, the large-scale data analysis industry that occurred after the September 11th, 2001 attacks was not necessarily considered to be optional. It was infrastructural. And the question wasn't who was doing this best, but who could stabilize the system first, who could do it immediately. The parallel here is that was not inevitable. Whomever they contracted with, it was path dependence under the anxiety, under the fears. Once that system works well enough, well, what do we see today? After 9/11, the United States didn't invent a new surveillance state from scratch, but they leaned into their private contractors who knew, or who the United States believed knew, who could stabilize the chaos that people felt faster than the public institutions would be able to adapt to. Not that different from what happened in the early 1800s. In this sophisticated fulcrum point that we're looking at here, we want to see the restraint that people take in terms of marketing themselves as brilliant or as destined. Instead, they just see themselves as humans who are reliable to answer a call to address a problem that a state or that other actors cannot seem to afford to do yet. That is non-negotiable in terms of a larger vision. Systems under stress will choose continuity over perfection. Okay, so the War of 1812 does not make DuPont a household name, but it does make them essential. It makes them necessary. The British blockades are causing foreign supplies to collapse. Domestic production is making a difference between their strategic embarrassment and a functional sovereignty. Domestic production becomes the difference between being a strategic embarrassment and being a functional state. People don't talk about powder in speeches, but you can feel its presence wherever that war is going to reach. In the early 1800s, the United States discovers that independence isn't a concept. It isn't a lot of great vibes and unintended fireworks. It's about managing the logistics. Once the War of 1812 has wrapped up, there are a lot of lessons that stick around. From this point forward, DuPont is not assessed on a case-by-case basis anymore. The contracts are stabilizing. Relationships that they formed begin to thicken. What started as an experimental scenario along the Brandywine River turns into a practice, part of national planning. That marks the first and the most significant change in the company's history. The decades that follow are not necessarily dramatic in a popular sense. They're not cinematic. They're not maybe even appropriate for prestige television, but they are decisive in a way that makes organizational sense. It does not chase the novelty. They don't chase innovation. They don't chase anything, actually. They consolidate their reliability. They refine their process. They continue to follow the process, and they formalize safety to a certain extent, not because they wish to appear humane, though, but because that uncontrolled failure threatens the entire system that they are now anchoring their future on. The explosions, like I said at the beginning, continue, but they become legible events rather than existential ones. They learn how to fail without disintegrating. That capacity, more than any single innovation that we talk about from this period in US history to today, the maturation of a corporate commercial empire. Equally important, though, is what DuPont does not become in the mid-19th century. It doesn't disperse geographically in ways that dilute control. It doesn't fragment into speculative ventures. They remain in Delaware, not because they love Delaware, but because Delaware provides what their enterprise requires: jurisdictional respect for privacy, legal patience, and a political culture that understands that containment is better than display. The Brandywine remains not just historical origin, but a template for how power through powder can be organized spatially. As the U.S. industrializes, including after the Civil War, DuPont faces a second inflection point. The nation's material needs to expand rapidly. And what do they do this through? They do this through railroads and mining and construction and manufacturing that demands explosives at scale unimaginable at the beginning of the 19th century. This is where a lot of firms begin to specialize narrowly and extract rent from a single advantage. But This particular company does something like far more unique, in my view, and intriguing. It generalizes their competence. What they learn, though, is to manage power and powder, but also to manage the danger that's presented to them through their process. So the knowledge that they acquire is portable. By the late 19th century, the company begins to move decisively into chemistry beyond explosives, not as a diversification of theater. They're never about theater. They're about nitroglycerin, dynamite, smokeless powder, and a broader chemical portfolio that emerges from the same organizational grammar that the aforementioned components have. And that grammar has a few rules. The rules are controlled inputs, disciplined procedures, environmental management, and institutional stability. This is also like the period in which DuPont becomes unmistakably bureaucratic. The most Weberian, I think that's what I would say, sense possible. Authority is not personal, in other words, it's procedural. Knowledge is archived and there is a routine to their decisions. They maintain control within their family and operate through the government structures rather than charisma or likability or public relations. They survive generational turnover because brilliance becomes largely irrelevant. The system is what's important here. By the year 1900, 100 years, more than 100 years after they arrived in Rhode Island, DuPont is no longer best understood as a company among others. It is a node of the American state's material nervous system, not formally part of the government, inseparable from how the survival and the processes of the government imagines its own capacity. This is an uncomfortable position for everyone. The company manages it the only way it knows how. Staying uninteresting, being boring, as boring as you can anyway when you're dealing with explosives. Then comes Europe's slow descent into catastrophe. Now, instead of attacking North America, they're just attacking each other by 1914. The United States is not a combatant, but DuPont is implicated. The scale of the conflict shatters any remaining illusion that the modern war can be supplied artisanally or improvisationally. The explosives then are consumed at the industrial rate that DuPont can supply, and production is about sustaining annihilation. Production is key. DuPont expands during this period because the global system at this point has once again narrowed its tolerances. Reliability overwhelms the preferences. The consistency makes them seem like the inevitable choice once again, and alternatives collapse again under the time pressure of the First World War. The firm's existing capacity and the discipline that they have practiced for over 100 years, as well as the embeddedness politically that they've already made themselves known as, make it one of the few actors capable of scaling without an immediate breakdown. From escaping France 100 years ago to now going back to Europe to 1917 when the United States enters the war, DuPont is no longer simply supplying a state. They are now at the center point of that boundary between public necessity and private execution that becomes so thin as to be almost theoretical, but ultimately applicable. This is not a story about corruption, although you could argue that, certainly, but that's not what I'm focusing on today. It's about codependence. Here's a critical point, especially for people that are speaking from the context of Wilmington. By the First World War, DuPont is no longer a story about chemistry at all. It's a story about how modern institutions can absorb responsibilities without absorbing visibility. By staying out of the center and yet putting themselves in the center through their works, their reliability does the public relations for them. They don't need to persuade you. You just need to see the results. They've perfected a role that will define the 20th century. A private organization stabilizing a public vulnerability while remaining structurally deniable in a legal sense. The idea that the United States could exist without firms like DuPont has become almost unthinkable. Not because it's impossible to imagine other futures. It's not a story of inevitability. But the act of replacing it would itself be the greatest risk of all, probably. That's the inheritance of the Brandywine River. It's not innovation. It's not genius. It's not patriotism. It's not loud. It is powerful, slow, disciplined construction of being reliable in a world that keeps on making noise and discovering how fragile it is. Once that reliability exists, history rarely lets go. This is part 1 of the episode. I'll release part 2 soon, and I hope that you're having a good holiday, a good rest of this year. I will talk to you on the next episode. This has been Decisions at the Fulcrum. I'm Dr. William Hoffman, and I will talk to you next time.